lost a world the other day. Has anybody found? You'll know it by the row of stars around its forehead bound. A rich man might notice it, yet to my frugal eye, of more esteem than ducats, oh find it, sir, for me. Hello and welcome to A Pilgrimage of Poetry. I'm Joanna and I'm here with my co-host Harrison, and you just heard Lost by Emily Dickenson, and we will be discussing her today, some of her works, her life, and everything about her. So take it away, Harrison.
Amazing. Okay, like I mentioned before when we were talking pre-episode, this is something that I've been looking forward to a lot, and in doing the research, Emily Dickenson is a fascinating character, and I don't know how much is common knowledge or how much is obscure. But what I've noticed is the things that everyone seems to know about Emily Dickenson is kind of wrong, or it's at least misleading. So anyway, let's dive into this. I cannot.
Do you have any common misconceptions about her, or what do you think everybody knows about her generally?
So honestly, a few things that everyone seems to think, right? She was super introverted. She hated socializing. She hated people, or at least being around people. She always wore white. She was vehemently against any of her works being published, right? Mm-hmm. That's the stuff that I have heard before I did the research for this. That's the stuff that I've heard other people say, and you look into it, and some of that is based on truth, or you can you see where we got there as far as stuff being published, and there was only a minute percentage of stuff that was published while she was alive. I've written down here, one letter of hers was ever published, was ever made public. Okay. And she wrote hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of letters. She spent her time writing. If it wasn't letters, it was poetry. If it wasn't poetry, it was writing letters to her sister-in-law, or to the pastor in Philadelphia, or potential lovers and whatnot.
Kind of reminds me of Jane Austen in that respect.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I recently read, it was a fictional book, but it was kind of about her life, sort of. And what I learned from that is that she wrote a lot to her sister, Cassandra. And,
I didn't know that.
And not a lot of her letters are published because they simply don't exist anymore. Cassandra destroyed them for some reason. Not sure what happened with that. I have not done the research on it. But from what I know of her, she basically spent her life either writing her stories or writing letters. So interesting parallel there.
Yeah. For Emily Dickenson, this is something that we will probably get to a little bit later on, because most of the publishing happened after she died, and it's actually a very intriguing and somewhat, I guess, depending on if you like Family Feuds, it's very fascinating or very sad. One of the two. I find it fascinating, but to each their own in all of that regard. So, overview. Emily Dickenson was born December 10th, 1830. So 1900, or the 19th century. She's recognized as one of the earlier American poets, or one of the better, at least one of the best in this day, American poets. But a lot of her influences, as far as what influenced her poetry and stuff, were Emerson. You can see a lot of similarities between Dickinson and Emerson. He was a huge influence, but was born and was raised in Amherst, Massachusetts, right in the middle. It's a small town. Honestly, I'm not sure of all the geography. I've never actually been there myself. But they grew up in a fairly conservative, I think, Protestant-oriented home. And another one of those misconceptions about her life is that her father was not supportive of her writing career. He was kind of a traditionalist, and he gets confused often of misogyny, or at the very least, having a chauvinistic perspective, because he valued a lot of the traditional or conservative things, with men and women being in their roles, and the women doing a lot of the traditional domestic activities. But at the same time, you can tell he loved his daughters, all of his children, not just his daughters. And like for 1 year, he gave her a present. I forget exactly what the present was. I think it was maybe a book, with several different authors or something that aided her inspiration. He made some connections for her throughout her life, and it was like, okay, you can see from a lot of his attitude or his perspective how you can get the that he wasn't in support, but in reality, it's like, you know, he was living in his culture in his time, which would have been 1830s, 1840s there. That was one of the things that I found interesting. So their household grew up very conservative. Their father was conservative Protestant and believed in strictness and a lot of things that you just associate with the Protestants, especially, you know, mid 19th century. The house that they grew up in played an interesting factor. So if my memory serves me correctly, because of financial difficulty, kind of early childhood of Emily Dickenson, they had to sell the family estate, like the family home, which was that house there on Main Street in Amherst. And they had to move to a smaller cottage because of financial difficulty.
It's really interesting because that is exactly what happened to Jane Austen's family.
Are they secretly the same person?
I don't know that.
Probably not. Probably
New
not.
conspiracy theory. No.
Right.
Yeah, but they too had like an estate and financials were just not working out. So they had to sell it. I think Jane Austen's brother, Edward, did end up being able to like buy it back. So it stayed in the family. Her and her sister at least moved into a cottage later. So that's just very interesting.
Well, that's really interesting that you say that, because it was really Emily's grandfather that was instrumental in having the financial downfall. They moved to the cottage, grandfather passed away, and Emily's father actually became financially stable again, and so they bought it back. Like they actually moved back to the house. Same exact scenario. Same exact scenario.
That is
so
interesting.
Crazy. I think I might have to look into this. There's some uncanny similarities here.
Yeah. I should say that all of this information just came from a book, and I did not do any of my own research, so I might be saying incorrect things here.
Right.
And my memory is definitely faulty.
It may be one of those things, like for all you listeners, like trust but verify type of thing. Like the information generally is accurate. The exact quotation, the exact time and date, like... We'll see.
Certified historians.
No, by no means. Just enthusiasts is all. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sometimes enthusiastically wrong.
But hey, that's better than like apathetically correct, right?
Exactly.
There we go. I like that. Anyway, so Emily, she had one older brother, Austen, and parents Samuel Dickinson and mother Emily Sr.
And it's very interesting to me that she shares a name with her mother. I don't know a lot about like the history of people naming their children, but I don't know that happens a lot, because usually it's like father to son because of everything was entailed on the males. Side. So
yeah, exactly. Honestly, that's I hadn't thought of that. I just thought, it's pretty typical to pass a name down a generation. But you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of especially on the maternal side of the family, taking the mother's name.
And especially as a first name too, because like often a middle name even could be done that way instead of a first name. And maybe there are more people and it was more common than we know, but we just don't know because nobody bothered to mention it because nobody's daughter was inheriting the estate.
Exactly.
Or like
we always learn about the oldest son in history, not the oldest daughter. I saw here her older brother was named William Austen. I had taken notes differently, and in a lot of the research I saw complications with how he was addressed. But we'll call him William.
He just had 50 nicknames and nobody knows. Is he
Bill,
like
William? Yeah.
Yeah.
All the different
He
ones.
sounds like a character in The Brothers Karamazov or something like that, where nobody knows the actual name and they go by 30 different others. So it's just a mystery.
That might just be my confusion, not actually, in his day and age. I'm sure they knew who they were talking to and about. But
probably.
Yes. Anyway, Emily grows up with older brother William Austen, and younger sister, Lavinia. And Lavinia and Emily are actually really close. They shared the family house after they moved back to the estate, the family estate, after it was repurchased and after their parents died. So Emily and Lavinia shared the housekeeping. They managed the property. I mean, more or less managed the property, at least the family property, because when William got married, he and his wife Sarah built a second house on the estate, and so they frequented each other's places often. So that was the growing up experience, or the family setting as far as growing up in Victorian New England.
Sounds pretty typical to me.
Right. Yeah, exactly. She attended a primary school first. It was like a 2-room deal. And then the academy. And this is a lot of misconception happened in the academy, or in retrospect, in research about her life, because it was a missionary school. It was a school for missionaries, especially the Protestant age. But like they taught all of the standard academic subjects, but then they also taught some doctrinal theology. And in the school, at least in my research, it seemed to be fairly common that everyone was either committed to a mission or a church or was baptized or something like that. Although it wasn't just 100% expected in like the community. Her father wasn't a church member at the church they went to until I think he was maybe 30 or 35 years old. It was not too uncommon to not necessarily be an official member. And it's one of the things that's often pointed out with her life. One of the actual myths is like she was ostracized because she didn't fit in with, her class or her family or her community because she refused to join the church. She wasn't baptized when she was a part of the academy. She was an amazing academic. But what didn't really follow the trend as far as making the public statements that apparently were expected to have been made, or something like that.
So you're saying that she, in attending this school, was kind of an odd one out because her family wasn't necessarily associated with like a specific church or like a specific mission even, or she was just kind of there for academics, not necessarily missions.
It wasn't so much the family as much as individual. So
okay. So
personally.
She personally, yeah.
It seemed to be odd in the school, but in the community at large, it didn't seem to be that uncharacteristic to participate but not have like an affiliated commitment or membership of a church or mission body. And it's one of those things that's kind of blown out of proportion because people think, oh, she was so ostracized. Well, like not that much, not that, just like a little bit ostracized, if even that much.
Right.
It's one
just
of those
like different, maybe not
Yeah.
even ostracized, just like
Yeah.
she just didn't happen to be
Yeah.
fit this same mold that maybe everybody
Right.
else going
Right.
to that school was. Yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
and it was noticed. Like it was observed. We can tell a lot from her letters and her writing. Like the closeness of friends that she had. She had very few close friends. She had a lot of acquaintances, but few close friends. And we'll get to those friends as we continue on in discussing her life. One of her close friends in the academy died from, I think, tuberculosis while they were in school, and that had a huge effect on her perspective, on her engagement level, on her involvement, the social activities and stuff. And even you can see a lot in her writings how she doesn't shy away from a lot of morbidity or writes often about death and sorrow. That was a part of that. Her mother died after being sick and ill for a long time, and Emily Jr. being like the main caregiver to her mother for a large portion of time before her mother died, also affected like a lot of that mentality for influencing the works that she created later. But it was notable in that her friend, I think Sarah, was one of the closest friends that Emily had. And Sarah ended up marrying William. By the way, I was looking back in the notes and I saw under his name William Austin also known as Austin. Like, he actually had more nicknames. I did not realize that before. But yes, anyway.
So it's not just you. He really did have
It's not just
a bunch
me.
of names.
I was right. I was right in the beginning. So she was really good friends with Sarah, and no, not Sarah. Susan. What am I thinking? Not Sarah. Susan. That's what happens when you don't have the words in front of your face as you share it. But Susan became her sister-in-law, and my understanding is they were actually fairly close friends before Susan was married to William. But
I feel like I should clarify for a second. So this whole time you've been saying Sarah, it's actually Susan?
it's actually Susan.
Okay, so
This
all
may
of
be
the
one of those-
Sarahs mentioned is
Are
Susan.
Susan. Yes.
Okay, just
All of
wanted
the
to
Sarahs.
clarify that, and just
That
because
may
I
be
didn't know if there were
something-
other Sarahs.
That may be something that we need to edit out in post-production. Susan, former Gilbert, now Dickenson, when Susan and William became married, they built a small house on a bordering real estate to the main mansion. And so Emily and Susan were in each other's houses all the time. And Susan was, I believe, the person that Emily wrote to the most as far as letters, and oftentimes in her letters she would include little pieces of her own poetry that she'd written, which is why we have a lot of the record as to, what influenced her and what was important to her and big events in her life was because of a lot of these letters to Susan. And it's also a partial reason as to why a few of Emily Dickinson's poems were published while she was alive. It turned out like 10 or so poems of Emily's were published while she was alive, and I think for most of them she used an alias because she didn't want the publicity. But that's another one of those myths, is that she didn't want her poems to be published. She submitted some of her own poetry to an anonymous it wasn't a compilation at first. It would turn into a compilation. At first, I think it was a competition. It was a poetry competition. She sent it anonymously.
Okay.
And then the person who had convinced her to send it anonymously was like, "Hey, these are really good. Can I get a couple for a compilation or a book that I'm putting together of several different authors? You don't have to send your name. It can be anonymous." And so she consented to that. Susan obviously had as many as 200 poems that were written in letters from Emily. And
wow,
so
that's
she was
a lot.
quite a few, actually, yeah. To be fair, over the course of her life, Emily wrote over 1,800 poems. So, I mean,
I
that's
don't
kind
think
of
I've
impressive.
even broke the 100 count. So, like,
Yeah, same. One of my New Year's, quote, resolutions. I hate resolutions because they're...
New Year's, I like to use the word New Year's aspirations or goals.
There we go. I like that. So one of my New Year's aspirations was can I write 100 poems this year? And turns out already that's kind of a tall task, depending on how much time you spend at it and how much inspiration you have.
Right.
During what a lot of researchers or those who study Emily Dickinson's life, they call the inspiration years. During one of those years, she wrote over 360 poems.
Wow. In
which
one
is-
year.
In 1 year, yeah. Over 360 poems. It's amazing. Like an average
Yes.
of 1.1, 1.2 poems a day. Yeah, very inspirationally saturated.
Yeah.
Okay. Something we can always just oh man, I wish, right? But yeah, and like you mentioned, a lot of them are fairly short works. The 8 lines, 12 lines, 10 lines, or whatever per poem. But
still, that's still impressive to
yeah,
put
Yeah.
words together in a nice cadence that
Right.
usually rhyme
Right.
every day. Sounds
yeah,
like a lot of work.
yeah. What is it that Longfellow said? Authors ramble, poets rhyme, or something like that.
Okay.
An author just
I like
scribbles
that.
on forever and ever and ever. A poet puts whatever I need to say in a concise form. I like that, which is also why you can see her gaining popularity upon the publication of a lot of her works post her death, because she's not afraid to write on these really, touching topics that really impact a lot of individuals that did not have the gift of words like she did, and resonated with a lot of people in ways that a lot of other poetry hadn't, or in ways they couldn't even maybe articulate. A lot of those short works, a lot of those topics, and how she dealt with them, and how she put them into concise words, and even her style of writing.
It is so fascinating to me how, even as like a writer / poet myself, whatever you want to title it as, there are still things that I cannot put into words that other people have, that is just the right mix of them together that just expresses exactly what I'm feeling, which, I mean, I think is the beauty of the craft, because not everyone, I mean, nobody's going to be saying the same thing the same exact way.
Right.
And I also think it's really good for authors and writers and poets and whatever to like get together and share their works, because it's so inspiring to me when I talk to other people who have written and I read their works and things like that, and it's like, wow, like it's no competition at all. It's just inspiration.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why, if you haven't gone and listened to the rest of our narrated poetry, listening to other people's poetry is like gold for inspiration. It is incredible. If you want to be able to go and write more, like, go and listen to it. And I'm not even sure, but I feel like there's a strong even difference between reading it, like sight reading it, and listening to it.
I actually learned something about this the other day, that when you are reading something, and this applied more to books, but same concept.
Yep.
When you are reading something with your eyes, that was logical, but
as opposed to how most of us do it with our nose, of course. Yeah.
Exactly. When you are reading words, you often skip over like the filler stuff, like and the, and like even like taglines if you're reading a lot of dialogue and stuff like that. But when you are listening, your brain is forced to like process every single word. Yeah. And so that's why audiobooks count as reading, and ironically almost count more than actual reading.
Okay, now we're just pushing lines.
No, I know.
Come on.
Not quite. No,
you have to specify if it's an audiobook.
Yeah. No, I agree. Specify if it's an audiobook, but you can still say you read it.
Sure.
That's my personal opinion.
With the little asterisk, like, it was in audio form. But
read
anyway.
with ears. See, that's why I specified eyes. There was a logic to that.
It is different. There is difference.
Yeah. And I'm sure there are specific things you get with reading. I mean, I know there are things you get with reading that you don't get with listening, but like, there's definitely something to be said for listening to things. And even, especially with audiobooks too, like somebody else putting a specific cadence on something that maybe you wouldn't in your own mind, or do you even read with cadence in your head? I don't know. Maybe that's person to person.
It might be.
Maybe they can like put things in a new light that you didn't think about, or sometimes like just hearing words in a different voice just opens up worlds. So
it would almost be weird if it didn't, honestly. Like, are you engaged? Are you actually listening, or are you just like noise, ears together?
Back to Emily Dickenson.
Yeah.
Names.
All right.
Such a trial.
Yes. Honestly, and that's one of those things is like, okay, when you're referring to multiple people, how much effort do you go in? Do we just like use last names? Well, you can't with a family. Like,
that's true. That's kind of difficult.
Yeah.
First,
anyway,
middle and last name every single time.
See, that would get really, really old. Or we would just really up our minute count. Like, we're gonna have a whole episode of just like character listings. You know how some books have like lists of characters in the front and who they. Yeah, for sure. Honestly, that might not be a bad idea, though, because I get
Yeah.
confused with how many characters are involved and everything. Anyway,
Yeah.
Emily Sr. was like the picture perfect 19th century, early 19th century Victorian housewife. Like, she kept an immaculate house. She
Good for
was,
her. Can't relate.
yes, right? Like, she had everything organized. Everything was completely spotless. She cared tremendously about the house cleaning, general home care, Victorian home care, and cooking, baking, and also enjoyed gardening. She did not pass on the love of just housewife duties, but Emily Jr. did enjoy baking and gardening. And in fact, one of the subjects in school that she did really well in was botany.
Oh,
And
nice.
um, they ended up building a greenhouse type of a thing on the estate that they lived in so that she could grow, climate sensitive plants year round, especially living there in Massachusetts, like not always climate friendly. But
I hear
um,
their winters are a little bit frigid.
that's what I've heard. Yeah, I'm sure if we went and scrutinized some of her works, we might find some references to cold or something. I don't. Maybe not.
Probably.
Probably.
Yeah. Well, death doesn't always have to refer to people. Just saying.
Facts.
So
That's actually true.
she could have been writing about winter.
Yeah, honestly, some of that I doubt, but I mean, the possibilities are endless. I'm not going to be the one to say no. And yeah, there were even stories of later in her life when Lavinia was married and out of the house, and she was living in the larger house alone, except for the housekeepers and stuff, that the children would come by the house after school, like walk out on the sidewalk, and she would lower from her upstairs window. She would lower a basket of like cookies or baked goods.
Oh,
And
that's fun.
right, how much of that is myth? How much of that is truth? She did like to bake. She did enjoy baking, and we know that she went to great lengths later in her life to avoid personal interaction with most people.
Do we know a reason for that, or she just preferred it?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that because you can see early in her life she was very social. She had like a first love or first boyfriend. It's debated whether he was a true love or not because she didn't seem as passionate about him as she did with someone else in her life later on. But see, she was social. She attended parties and she had connections, if not close friends. She had a few close friends, but mainly just connections. Later on in life, and this is more what we know about because this was the time when she was writing most of her letters, most of her poetry, she kept a clean room and she stayed in her room, was mainly where it went. At some points when callers would stop in, you might get a glimpse of like the hem of her dress as she ran up the stairs trying to avoid callers. And there's debated outcomes, but there was a story about a man whose impact in her life is again debated. He was potentially a publisher. He was potentially a lover. I've heard different things in my research, but she refused to come downstairs. And so he was reported to say, "Come down, you rascal, or I'll have to come up and get you." And I've heard that she didn't come down, but maybe there was a laugh from upstairs. Or I've heard that she did come down. Regardless, in one of her letters to this gentleman, she referred herself, or she signed off the letter as "your little rascal." Obviously, the connection. So
Yeah.
in avoiding visitors, that was more of a thing later in life, and she did converse, although there were some instances where maybe a conversation from the top of the stairs to the bottom of the stairs, and you can't see each other, but there was conversation happening, although even that was rare. It seems as though most of her social connectivity or interaction with another human happened in letter writing, because she would write a letter and then in response to correspondence, obviously with Susan, her sister-in-law, and
Susan, not Sarah.
Susan, not Sarah. Yes. Again, how much and why that's the really big question is why people have thrown out crazy ideas. I mean, with as popular as she had been, Man, there are some non-PG rated ideas out there. I don't know if you've looked into
I'm
any of them,
sure.
but
I have not, but
yeah, I
yeah.
guess if you are either sensitive to these topics or like under, I don't know, 13 years old, they're just a little bit sensitive. So one of the
Yeah.
theories that has really been put out there is that Susan and Emily were lovers because of how
Interesting.
close they were, and there's a lot of suggestive writing that happened in Emily's letters. Like it was much more common to show very, very forward affection, even to close friends, right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily in a romantic way, but in a caring way, right? Or I'm not sure what like the depth of a friendship, but not romantically. But there are
Yeah.
some things that she wrote in her letters that are very suggestive, and any kind of a modern perspective that you take on it is going to appear really suspicious. I mean, really
Sure.
suspicious
Yeah.
with a lot of that. So
Yeah.
there
Which is
was
why it's useful to keep historical context in place.
even then there were lines, if I can
But yeah.
remember correctly, such as "And you, oh sweet, I cannot wait until our lips are pressed together in warm affection," or something like that. Very just stuff that you wouldn't necessarily find in a modern,
Yeah.
a contemporary,
Yeah.
piece. But I personally don't see that as an accurate assumption or theory. I think we're kind of attributing modern understanding or modern ideals to a historical reference, which is always kind of dangerous to do,
Yeah. That
because
would make
you find out
sense.
who you are by looking in the past is one of those
Yeah.
things. Very fascinating, all the same. Uh, Obviously, her relationship with Susan was one of the reasons why we have so much context of what she wrote and how much she wrote. There was another person who was very instrumental, especially after her death, that she honestly, she never said if she did or didn't like this person. But the person is, wait for it, Mabel Loomis Todd. Let's try this again. Mabel Loomis Todd. Mabel Loomis Todd was the woman who William, her older brother, was having an affair with later on in life. It's a
Oh,
very
interesting.
interesting story. Yes. And I was dumbfounded when I heard all of the information about it, because I'm like, how did this fly? But Susan and William are still married. They still live in their small home on the grounds, the Dickenson grounds. And somehow Mabel Todd was like integrated with the family. Like, she knew all of the family. This was nothing secret. None of this was secret. It seemed very public. This was like
And
Mabel was
everybody was
trying
just
to.
okay with this.
I don't know. Was it basically everyone was like, "Hey, William, Austin, Dickinson, like, I disapprove, but your life?" Or was everyone like, "Hey, I kind of like Mabel a little better than I like Susan"? Don't know. I don't know.
Interesting.
There was some feudal stuff that was happening with the families later on.
I see.
And Emily removed herself from the place. Like, she didn't want to take her brother's side or the Dickinson family side, because my understanding is Lavinia wasn't just pro Mabel Todd.
Sure.
In my opinion, understandably, but hey, who am I to speak?
Interesting dynamics.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. That's what it is. There were stories about Mabel trying to get to know Emily better, working her way into the family, whatever you want to ascribe the reason to it. But
Yeah.
she heard that Emily liked the piano, and she would come in the house and play the piano. Emily never really came downstairs, but I read about maybe she opened her door and listened from upstairs and enjoyed the piano playing. And then later in a letter would reference the music that she'd heard and stuff like that. Mabel threw kinks in the whole family's dynamic. I mean, it was...
Yeah.
Yeah, it caused a lot of trouble, especially after Emily's death, because Lavinia and Mabel had different opinions as to how to and or when to and who receives the profits from publishing a lot of the works after Emily died.
All right, that's where we're going to break for today. And that concludes part 1 of our discussion of Emily Dickenson. If you are a member of our Patreon, you can go over and catch the second part right away. If you are not, you can catch the second part in a couple of weeks, and we'll see you then. Bye.